Two children promised to meet again when they grew up, but neither expected. One would be stuck in a lonely town, while the other would drift across many lands and return 20 years later with a painful past. What happens when a naive promise from a 10-year-old becomes the only thing that holds the heart of a man who has lost so much? And what happens to the woman who has lived half her life protecting her sick father in this remote town? If it were you, what would you do when the only person who ever called your name with all sincerity suddenly returned? Would you open the door to your buried memories, or continue to choose the safety of familiar ways of life? This story is more than just a reunion. It is a test of the heart, whether one dares to love again after years of suffering and loss. If you have ever kept an old promise in your heart, wished for someone to come back, or feared your own heart, this story will touch you. Please stay and start this healing journey with us. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on the stories that touch your heart. Mornings in Silverbrush always began with the sound of wind rustling through the wooden fences that lined the 600-foot dirt road. The wind was a constant visitor, arriving before the sun had even risen above the eastern hills. It carried the scents of hay, old pine, and sometimes the metallic scent of a blacksmith shop that had been closed for years. Maren Whitfield stood in her front yard, clutching a cold steel bucket of water. The early morning sunlight slanted through the rotten wooden eaves, casting a soft golden glow on her thin shoulders. Her father, Mr. Whitfield, coughed from inside the house, each cough a faint line across his already heavy chest. "Are you okay?" Dad Maren turned to ask, but only heard him trying to catch his breath. Living in Silverbrush had never been easy, especially since she had just turned 30 and her life felt like it was confined within the four walls of a small wooden house. The quiet town had had harsh winters and summers so long that everything seemed to fade in the sun. When her mother was alive, the Whitfields had always sung every night, but since her mother died, the silence between meals had grown longer, so long that Maren sometimes found herself melting into it. It was that silence, in a strange way, that had sustained her for so many years. It was her shield, her place to hide her sadness where no one could touch her. This morning was like any other, until Maren heard it, the distant sound of hooves, steady and heavy, as if pressing down on the thin layer of ash from the town. The hooves were different, not hurried, not stealthy. They had the rhythm of someone used to hundreds of miles of roads, someone not easily swayed by wind or sun. Maren frowned slightly. She held up her hand to block the sunlight, trying to see through the rising dust. A rider appeared in the middle of the dirt road, as if from her own memories. He rode a dark brown horse, his wide-brimmed hat pulled low, lengthening his face in the morning sun. Yellow dust clung to his faded denim shirt and the red scarf draped loosely around his neck. He sat upright, calm. He approached, and when he was a few dozen feet away, he slowly pulled on the reins. The horse stopped, dust falling like rain. Maren held her breath. The man raised his face, and his calm gray eyes met hers, eyes she had never forgotten, even though 20 years had passed like the dry desert wind. "Ellie." His voice was low and soft, like a note lost in the air. "It's me." There were no shouts of joy, nor steps to run and hug each other like the stories people often tell. There was only silence between two people who had experienced too much loss to know that strong emotion sometimes cannot be expressed in words. Maren stood still. She felt as if time had slipped back, dragging her childhood back to her. The afternoons they'd floated paper boats down the Ridge Valley stream. The times they'd climbed the highest ledge at Silverbrush to watch the birds fly home. And the day Asher Doyle had left with the wagon train heading north. The 10-year-old boy who'd said to her, "When we grow up, if you still remember, I will come back." Maren remembered. And what confused her the most right now was that he really had come back. Asher. She called his name, almost not believing her eyes. A smile appeared at the corner of his lips, a tired but genuine smile. "Yeah, I'm home. Ellie." The wind blew. The wooden wind chime hanging on the porch chimed softly. That was all. But Maren felt her heart tighten. At that moment, a figure appeared on the opposite side of the street. Sheriff Elias Turner. He leaned against the office door, his arms crossed over his chest, his sharp eyes silently observing Asher. His presence was a heavy dot in the slowly lightening sky. Asher Doyle returned to Silverbrush, Sheriff Turner said softly. Enough for Maren to hear, but not enough to be considered a question. There hasn't been a visitor to this town in years. Asher turned his head slightly and replied calmly, "I am not a guest. Sheriff, I am just returning to my old home." The sheriff did not reply. His expression was not angry, but wary, as if this return brought with it something he did not want to face. Maren clenched her fists on the bucket handle, her heart pounding. She didn't know why Asher looked at her that way, warm and yet unspeakable. 20 years was a long time. Long enough to erase many memories, but not long enough to make her forget how safe she felt standing next to Asher. "Asher," she said, her voice so small that the wind almost carried it away. "Why, are you coming back now?" He looked at her for a long time, so long that she felt like his gaze could see through all the dust of her life. Then he said each word, low and firm, "Because it's time to keep my promise." Just that. One short sentence. One simple sentence. But it made all the years of silence come back to Maren. Sheriff Turner clenched his jaw, his eyes flashing suspiciously at Asher. Asher. He just looked at Maren, as if there was something between them that had yet to be named. The wind grew stronger. The grass on the roadside trembled. The town of Silverbrush that morning seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. And in that moment, Maren knew. Her life had just changed direction. Asher dismounted, his movements somewhat slower than the forceful presence with which he had first appeared, as if he were measuring each step between past and present. Maren held the edge of the bucket, and neither of them said anything more, just staring at each other in a pause long enough for the wind to pass through their breaths. Across the street, Sheriff Elias Turner stood still, watching. His eyes were a question mark. Maren knew the sheriff never liked the presence of strangers in town, especially one who seemed to have a clear purpose. Asher looked around Silverbrush. The familiar wooden houses were still there, older and weathered. The Whitfield fence still leaned to the left, probably from the strong winds. The blacksmith shop was closed, its brick walls gray. He turned back to Maren, his voice low, deep like a lightly touched harp. "This place has changed a lot, but it's still Silverbrush." She didn't know how to respond. She just nodded slightly, then looked up at the strong face that bore the marks of travel. Compared to the boy Asher, the man before her carried a strange calmness, a silence that had weathered many storms. Not an awkward silence. Her father coughed inside, a hoarse sound that startled Maren. She turned quickly to help him up. Asher stood outside the door, not entering. He just looked in as if to make sure they were both okay. When the coughing subsided, Maren turned back to the yard. Asher was still there. He stood tall, his hand resting lightly on the saddle. The sun was higher in the sky, casting warm shadows across his shoulders. She stepped closer, trying to keep her voice even. "How long are you going?" It took a while. There were a few dust storms along the way, but he still wanted to go home. The answer was short, but it weighed heavily on her heart. No one returned to Silverbrush because it was convenient. This was a land of passage, not a land of return. Yet Asher had chosen to return, just to keep the promise he had made at age 10. Sheriff Turner now left the office door and approached. His voice was low and serious, but not entirely unfriendly. "How long do you plan to stay here?" Asher did not answer quickly. He looked at Sheriff as if they had known each other in some other life. "Depends on whether my business is done or not. But I don't want to cause trouble for anyone." The sheriff was silent for a moment, then politely replied that the small town needed peace. As he turned away, Maren noticed something in his gaze that wasn't hostile, but rather the wariness of someone who had been hurt and wanted to protect what was precious. Asher looked after Sheriff, then turned back to her. "He cares about me." Maren shook her head slightly, her expression wavering. Sheriff Turner had always respected her and her father, but never more than was necessary. But the way he looked at Asher made her feel something different. "Don't say that. He's just worried about the town." Asher smiled slightly, but his eyes were calm, as if reading the empty spaces she herself did not dare to face. "Can you tell me what Silverbrush has been through?" They walked slowly toward the fence. Each step seemed to peel back layers of dusty memories. The wind blowing through the eaves sounded like an old song, and Maren shivered slightly. She looked up the long road toward the distant mountains, then spoke in a low but clear voice. "After my mother passed away, it was just the two of us in the house. My father was getting weaker. I stayed behind to take care of him. Sometimes I felt like I was floating in a room with no door." Asher listened, not interrupting. His silence made Maren feel understanding, not pity. "And you?" she asked softly. He left Silverbrush and followed the caravan north. He worked at odd jobs in scattered towns. For a while he thought he would settle down in Lewin Ridge, but things didn't work out. He had to move on. He had learned one thing, that loneliness doesn't go away just because you change your location. She looked at him closely. Part of his eyes was still the Asher of childhood, and part was the man he had become after so much loss. Maren said that Silverbrush had not changed much. The town was as quiet as it had always been. She did not expect anything new, and she herself did not seem to realize that she had grown so accustomed to sadness that she took it for granted. Asher placed his hand on the fence, lightly touching the rough old wood. "Are you happy?" "Ellie." The question came so suddenly that her heart stopped. It was a question everyone had asked themselves, but no one had the courage to say it out loud. She didn't answer right away. The wind blew, making her hair sway slightly as a vague answer. "Happiness. Maybe it's something I've forgotten somewhere." Asher turned, his eyes as calm as a lake. "If I forget it, can you go find it with me?" A simple statement. No over-promises, no demands, just a gentle offer, but enough to shake Maren's defenses. She pursed her lips. Something warmed and weighed down in her chest. Half of her wanted to believe. The other half was afraid that believing would hurt her again. She whispered that life was not based on old promises. Asher looked at her, his voice low. "No, but sometimes promises are the only thing that keep us from losing ourselves." Another silence fell. This time it wasn't heavy, but more like the sighs of two people standing on the threshold of something greater. As they spoke, Father Maren coughed violently inside. Asher immediately went to the door, but stopped when he saw her eyes. She said softly that she could handle it. He nodded, but the worry remained in his eyes. Before leaving, Asher said he would return after bringing his horse to the rest stop near Mesquite Hill. As he mounted, Maren felt a shift in her. Something was stirring, slowly but surely, as he walked away. Sheriff Turner emerged from his office, his eyes on Maren. "Does he have any reason to come back?" Maren looked down the dusty road, where Asher's silhouette had shrunk. She didn't answer, because the question wasn't for Sheriff, It was for herself, and she knew she wasn't ready to face it. But even though she didn't say it out loud, her heart trembled slightly at a thought that she didn't dare admit. Maybe Asher came back. For her. Maren went behind the house to rinse the towel she had used to care for her father. The water in the bucket reflected the pale sky of Silverbrush, though the town was deserted. Familiar sounds like the wind rustling the tin roof, the chain lightly clicking against the fence post, gave her a sense of stability. But today, with Asher's presence, things had changed a little. She kept hearing the sound of his horse's hooves echoing in her head. Each step he took on the old road also made her memories shift slightly like pages of a book turned by the wind. There were things she thought she had buried long ago, but it turned out that with just a look, a call, everything turned back. Maren gently placed the towel on the clothesline. When she turned around, Asher was standing a few feet away. He approached quietly, enough so as not to startle her, but his presence still made her heart skip a beat. "Do you remember Ridge Valley?" His voice was low, like a question both to remind and to test how much their memories matched. Maren looked into his eyes, which had seen too much. She nodded. Ridge Valley was where she and Asher had spent most of their childhood. They had run through the hay, picked berries, lay on their backs, looked up at the sky, and imagined the future. But what they remembered most was a small wooden box buried in the ground, containing a few meaningless objects that had meaning beyond reason. "Do you want to go there now?" "If you agree." His voice was hesitant, as if he were afraid of breaking something fragile between them. Maren looked into the house, making sure her father was asleep. She grabbed her light coat, then walked beside Asher without another word. Each step on the path leading out of Silverbrush felt like a collision of old memories. Ridge Valley wasn't far. They just had to walk through the knee-high grass and follow a path around some large boulders. When they reached the top, the valley opened up before them. The grass stretched out, and the wind blew through it in soft waves. It was so quiet that you could hear the dry grass rubbing against each other. Maren took a deep breath. The grass in Ridge Valley always smelled different. It was damp with earth, pungent with wild leaves, and a touch of sunlight from seasons past. It was like stepping back into a part of her childhood she had told herself no longer existed. Asher walked over to a large tree trunk torn off one side by lightning where they had marked the spot where the box had been buried. He bent down, brushing away the dead leaves with his hand. Maren knelt beside him, her hands shaking as she touched the dirt. She hadn't thought she'd see this place with Asher in a long time. The ground was a little dry, but not difficult to dig. After a while, a small wooden box emerged. It was covered in dust from time, but still held its shape. Maren touched the box as if touching a memory she had not dared to face for too long. She opened the lid. Inside were things that seemed worthless, but were filled with unnamed emotions. A faded blue ribbon, a small stone with a streak of light running down the middle, a piece of wood carved with an M and an A, and a piece of paper folded in four, written in childish handwriting with the cheap ink the town kids used. Maren unfolded the paper. The scribbled words were so simple it made her chest tighten. Just 4 words. "When we grow up." She touched the words, as if she could touch her own little hand from years ago. And, for the first time in many years, she allowed herself to feel the sadness and warmth from the past that she thought had faded away. Asher looked at her. His gaze was still deep, but this time there was a hint of hesitation. "Ellie, I don't know if I should come back here. Many times I thought maybe coming back would be awkward for you." She looked up at him. The wind whipped through Asher's crimson scarf, pulling the fabric lightly as if to ease the tension it had released. "Why do you think so? Because this is no longer a story of 2 children. You have your own life. You have things to take care of. And me. I have too many things to say." His voice was hoarse, as if he had been holding something back for years. Maren understood that silence was sometimes the only way a person could keep their weakest parts to themselves. Asher sat down on the grass, his eyes staring out at the foot of the hill. His voice was soft, but every word held weight. He had a friend, a young cowboy he met while working at Lewin Ridge. The boy considered him a brother. One day the fever struck him down. Before he died, he asked him to bring something back to Silverbrush. He kept his promise. But when he got there, the boy's last family had long since moved away. Maren felt her heart soften. She understood that it was not just about their childhood promise. Asher carried other promises, other losses, things that made a man as quiet as he was. Asher added that since her death, he had often thought about Silverbrush, thought about the wooden box they had buried, thought that if there was any place he could return to without feeling lost, it would be this place. Maren looked at him a long time, not with her eyes, but with a deeper understanding. She knew he was not someone who opened up easily, but today, in the valley where they used to run, Asher was saying what he had kept hidden for years. Ridge Valley became so quiet that she could hear her own heart beating. When Maren spoke, her voice was low and deep, like the old melody. There are things, if not said, will stay in the heart forever. But not everyone can find a place to confide. Asher looked into her eyes. "Do you ever feel left out?" Ellie. She did not answer at once. The sunlight fell on the grass in golden streaks like the last rays of day. The wind blew a few strands of hair across her cheeks. Not left behind. Just standing still while others moved on. "I get it." Asher nodded. He understood her unspoken words, and in the air of Ridge Valley, they reached a truth no one dared to name. Silence isn't always empty. Sometimes it's a place where broken hearts can stand together without too many words. Finally, Asher pushed himself up. "I want to take you home. The weather is about to change." Maren folded the paper and carefully put it in her pocket. She looked at him, her eyes softening a little. "Are you sure you're ready to face what's left of Silverbrush?" Asher looked straight at her. His gaze was as steady and deep as the bottom of a valley. "I'm ready, because I don't want to leave anything behind." After returning from Ridge Valley, Maren's mood changed in ways she couldn't explain. When she picked up the kettle near the stove, Asher's image sitting under the big tree was as clear as if she were looking at him. Every word he said, especially "I don't want to leave anything behind," echoed in her mind like a deep, unending beat. As she pondered, there was a sharp knock on the door. Sheriff Turner entered, his hat in his hand, walking slowly, as if he were hesitating between asking a question and remaining silent. His eyes scanned the room, then stopped on Maren's face. He asked if she was okay after seeing Asher again. The question was soft, but the implication was clear. Maren put down the kettle, trying to keep her voice even as she said that she and Asher were just stopping by Ridge Valley. "Oh, nothing more." The sheriff was silent for a few seconds before speaking in the deep voice familiar to the people of Silverbrush. He said that a few strangers had shown up in town the day before Asher returned. They hadn't come into the shop. They hadn't bought anything. They hadn't asked for water. They just asked around about a cowboy who had worked up north. They'd left shortly afterward. The behavior had made the sheriff wary. Hearing this, Maren felt a chill run down her spine. The things Asher had left unsaid, the dark corners of his eyes, all of them suddenly became heavier. But she couldn't say anything right now. She knew Asher wouldn't want his private matters misunderstood. Sheriff Turner looked deep into her eyes as if seeking confirmation that Asher had brought no trouble to Silverbrush. In the end, he said only a short sentence. "Be careful, Maren. Some people don't come back just because they promised." Those words lingered in her mind long after Sheriff left. When he was out of sight, Maren stood on the porch. From here she could see the small horse station near Mesquite Hill. There was a flickering light and the occasional sound of horses' reins. She knew Asher was in that direction. It wasn't far, but it was enough to make one's heart sink. She closed the door to keep out the draft. Her father lay there, breathing even but weak. The dead cowboy's mother flashed through her mind. The woman had come to Asher with shaking hands, her eyes too lost to hide her fear. Such events left traces that were difficult to erase. Night fell. The silence was so intense that Maren could hear light footsteps in the courtyard. She set her cup down on the table and stepped out onto the porch. Asher stood there, his coat on, his shoulders caked with dust. "Do you have time?" His voice was so soft that the wind almost blew away the words. Maren invited him in, but Asher only shook his head. He was afraid of waking her father. They sat on the wooden steps, where the light cast a soft yellow glow. A familiar silence fell over them, but this time it felt uneasy. Asher looked down the dim road that stretched out to the foot of the mountain, where the shadows of the trees melted into the night. His gaze searched for something hidden. Someone was following him. He was sure of it. Maren turned to look at him. The worry in his voice made her squeeze the hand on her knee. She asked why. He was silent for a long moment, as if debating whether to speak or hold back. People who worked with him. Some misunderstood. They thought he had something that belonged to the deceased. They believed it more than the truth. Maren knew it was about the cowboy friend Asher had cared for. Unspoken secrets suddenly became clearer. She sensed the weight that weighed on Asher was not just memories or pain, but also the danger that could strike at any moment. "Do you think?" "I shouldn't have come back here," Asher asked softly. Maren looked into his eyes. Part of her wanted him to leave this dangerous area, but the other part knew Asher was not the type to run again. He had carried too much loneliness on the road. Perhaps Silverbrush was the only place he could still believe in peace. She said softly that the decision to return was his own. If he chose to face it, she believed he was strong enough to stand firm. Asher let out a long breath, as if the words helped untangle some of the knots in his heart. But the tension in his strong shoulders did not melt away. He looked over at Maren's house. The light from the crack in the door fell on his face, making it seem near yet far, tired yet strong, worried yet calm. But he didn't say it. Maren could see it in his eyes. He wasn't just worried about himself. He was afraid of dragging her into danger. A strange figure appeared at the end of the street, catching their attention. It walked quickly toward the old tavern. Its face was unclear, but Maren recognized the strange long coat. Asher clasped his hands lightly on his knees, his whole body tensed in alertness. He stood up. "I have to go see what's going on." Maren touched his arm lightly. She didn't say anything to stop him, but her concern was obvious. "If anything goes wrong, come back here, Asher." He looked at her, his eyes softening. There was a hint of gratitude, a hint of regret. He answered in a soft but firm voice. "I will come back. I kept my promise once. I don't want to break any more." Asher walked away toward the tavern. His shadow stretched across the ground like a parenthesis to something unknown. Maren watched, her heart as tight as a string. She could feel a shadow following Asher, a shadow not just on the ground, but in the things he carried from his past. As his shadow faded into the dim light of the main street, Maren knew this was only the beginning. Asher's return had awakened more than memories. It had also awakened troubles lurking somewhere around Silverbrush. And in the silence that fell over the town, she understood that the coming days would not be as peaceful as before. In the old cabin, Mr. Whitfield's breathing was heavier than usual. Maren sat by the bed, placing a warm towel on her father's forehead. The room was lit only by a small oil lamp, casting flickering shadows on the walls. Each cough he made split the silence, making her heart sink with each beat. It was not easy to carry a life on her shoulders, especially when she had done it for so long. There were times when she wondered if she had forgotten what it felt like to have someone to protect her. She had long since gotten used to being alone, used to facing her worries every day without anyone to rely on. The wind whistled across the roof, as if someone were running on it. Maren pulled the blanket closer to her father's neck, then went out onto the porch to reset the latch. When she opened the door, a strong wind blew in, carrying with it the smell of dry earth and road dust. As she turned to close the door, she saw Asher standing under the large elm tree in the front yard. He leaned against the tree trunk, his hands in his coat pockets. He looked like someone seeking warmth in his own silence. She didn't know how long he'd been standing there, only that his face was half in shadow, but his gray eyes were still bright, as if he could see every movement in this town. "Are you still awake?" Asher asked, his voice low and deep. Maren stepped down from the porch and stood beside him. The wind blew through his scarf, making the fabric flutter. It reminded her of the afternoon they had spent in Ridge Valley. There was something about him that always made her feel both near and far. "My father's getting weaker," Maren said, trying to keep her voice steady. "I worry about the change in weather, his lungs not being able to handle it." Asher did not answer immediately. He looked to the window, where the oil lamplight cast a shadow over her father lying on the bed. His gaze was soft, as of one who knew all too well the fragility of precious things. "I'll be fine. You take good care of him." Maren smiled slightly, but the smile only made her eyes sadder. She looked at Asher, suddenly wanting to ask something she had been holding in since seeing him again. "Asher, are you still planning on leaving Silverbrush?" He bowed his head slightly, his shoulders stiffening a little. His eyes changed color, deeper, heavier. He propped his hands on his knees, as if gathering his thoughts to answer what she wanted to know. "If staying puts you in danger, I will leave." His voice low and almost a whisper. The answer shook Maren, not because he wanted to leave, but because she could hear the struggle in his voice. A struggle he didn't want anyone to share with him. "I'm not asking you to go," Maren said softly. "I just want to know what you really want." The wind picked up. The leaves rustled as if someone were talking. Asher glanced up at the sky, where a thin layer of clouds was drifting by, blocking out the faint light of the stars. "I want peace. I want to do the right thing. But sometimes, I don't know if the right thing is to stay or to leave." His voice was a little hoarse. He sounded like someone who had been on the road too long and tired of choosing paths at every crossroads. Maren knew that feeling better than anyone. She herself had been at the mercy of agonizing choices for years. Maren touched his arm lightly. It was a brief touch, but in that moment the defensiveness in Asher's eyes seemed to disappear. "Asher Doyle, you are not the one who is dangerous. It is those who chase after things that are not real that are the problem. Don't take all the blame on yourself." He looked at her, his eyes filled with gratitude and something else he dared not say. Maren realized that silence was not only his characteristic, but also the place where he hid the pain that no one had ever asked about. As she was about to say more, Sheriff Turner appeared at the gate. He carried a small bag of medicine, which he had given to her father, as was his custom. Each step the sheriff took reflected the heaviness of someone who had suffered more loss than anyone knew. Sheriff Turner greeted Asher with a brief nod. His eyes flicked between the two of them. There was no judgment, just something like an unspoken question. He placed the bag of medicine on the small table in the house and stepped out onto the porch. His voice was low and even as always. "Your father needs to take this for 2 days. When he runs out, I'll bring more. Thank you, Sheriff." After accepting his thanks, he looked at Asher longer, a look that wasn't exactly suspicious, but not entirely trusting either. The look of a man who had lost someone he loved once and was afraid to see someone else do the same. Asher stood still. His composure did not reassure the sheriff, nor did it upset him. Maren sensed a tension between the two men. Sheriff Turner walked away with a heavy step. When he was out of sight, Maren turned back to Asher. He followed the sheriff's gaze for a moment before looking back at her. He cares about me so much. Maren bowed her head slightly. He was kind, but there were some things that couldn't be bridged with kindness. Asher understood what she meant. Not everyone who cared could touch her loneliness. Not everyone understood the silence she survived with. The wind blew through the trees again. The sky stretched out as if to embrace them both. The feeling made Maren feel less alone than before. Asher stood beside her a beat longer. She heard his deep breathing and the uncontrollable beat of her own heart in response. She spoke very softly, as if only he could hear. If anything happens, Asher, don't face it alone. He looked at her for a long time. In that gaze, something softened and tensed like a string being pulled tight but still wanting to hold on to this rare piece. No one should face it alone. Asher replied, his voice lost in the wind, especially when there is someone to return to. That sentence made Maren's heart tremble as if a warm current ran through it, but before she could reply, a strange noise echoed from the street next to the tavern. A small rustling sound, but enough to draw Asher's gaze into the darkness. He tilted his head slightly, his shoulders tensed like a wild horse ready to spring at the slightest hint of danger. Maren looked on, feeling something was wrong. Asher dropped a sentence very softly. Someone is nearby, and she understood. All that was covering Silverbrush was only beginning to unfold. The wind on the dirt road leading out of Silverbrush was stronger than usual, carrying the dry, acrid smell of burnt grass and the rustling of twigs against each other. Maren stood by the door, staring into the darkness where Asher had directed his gaze. The stranger's figure had vanished, but the unease still lingered in her chest like a lingering note. Asher left the porch and walked down the small path to the woodshed behind the house. His figure was lost in the dim light of the wall lamp, but every movement showed that he was on full alert. The town was small, and the presence of strangers was never pleasant, especially when the story of Asher's pursuers still hung like a dark cloud. Maren wanted to follow him, but she stopped in the middle of the yard, choosing to stand still so as not to make a sound. She knew that if there was danger, Asher would not let it reach her first. It was that silent protection that warmed and weighed down her heart because she knew he carried a heavy burden. After a moment, Asher turned to her. He didn't say anything at first. Only when he was close did he let out a long breath. There was no one behind him anymore. Perhaps he was watching from a distance. Maren sensed the stiffness in his voice, the sound of someone used to always having to watch his back. She asked quietly if it had anything to do with his cowboy friend. Asher looked at her for a long moment, his eyes half concealed, half shared. Finally, he nodded. The story of Lewin Ridge did not end as smoothly as he said. People believed he left behind something of value, something he kept. They did not believe the simple truth that there was nothing. His voice was slow and low, as if each word was drawn from the deepest recesses of his memory. Maren felt her heart sink as she listened. She could imagine Asher's loneliness in this strange land, having just lost the man he considered a brother, and having to bear the burden of unnecessary misunderstanding. She asked Asher if what the other had left behind was truly meaningless. He shook his head, his gray eyes glinting with sadness. Not meaningless. But it's not what they want. You'll understand when you meet his mother. The name of the mother startled Maren. It took her a few seconds to remember the trembling voice of the woman who had come to Silverbrush not long ago. What she carried in her eyes was a loss that no words could fully express. Asher tells us that the cowboy's name was Jonah Kelman, a young man who dreamed of a peaceful place, a small house, a field to raise a few cows. Malaria took Jonah away on a road with no family in sight. In his final nights, Jonah only spoke of his mother, and the old lesson she had taught him: what matters most is not what you own, but what you leave in someone's heart. Maren felt her throat tighten. Asher continued that Jonah had sent him a small bag. Inside was only a diary and a hastily written suicide note. No gold, no maps, nothing to make anyone want to chase, but their companions didn't believe it. Just as Asher finished his story, there was a knock on the door. It wasn't loud, but it was enough to make them both turn around almost simultaneously. Maren opened the door. Standing before her was the woman they had spoken of. She stood there, breathing slightly shakily, holding an old canvas bag. "My son," she began, her voice hoarse and small. The last person beside him was this young man. Asher stepped forward, bowing respectfully. Jonah's mother, May Kelman, looked older than her years. It seemed as if the loss of her son had taken years from her life. She said she had read Asher's letter before, but she still wanted to see what Jonah had left behind. Her voice cracked as she said her son had died without anyone by his side except Asher. She thanked him for delivering his last message to the right place. Asher opened the small leather bag. The diary was neatly placed inside, next to the faded letter. May held her son's handwriting with trembling hands. Tears fell in the quiet room. She read a short passage, then clutched the paper to her chest. "Thank you for not letting Jonah go alone." The air was still, heavy and warm. Maren looked at Asher in that moment and saw a different Asher, not just the boy who returned to keep his childhood promise, but the man who carried the wounds of others in his heart to ease theirs. As May stood up to leave, Asher held her shoulder, his voice low but firm. "Jonah was a good man. I couldn't save him, but I could tell he thought of you with his last breath." May looked at Asher for a long time, her old eyes filled with gratitude and pity. "But you have to be careful. There are people who think Jonah is carrying something valuable. They won't stop there." After May left the house, the door closed softly, as if afraid to wake the tense atmosphere. Maren looked at Asher, seeing the fatigue in his eyes. "You're carrying more than you say, aren't you?" Maren asked. Asher didn't answer right away. He leaned against the table, his hands clasped together like someone trying to keep himself calm. "I don't want anyone in Silverbrush caught up in this mess, especially you." Maren stepped closer, not to comfort him, just to stand with him for a moment. The silence between them was strangely warm. "I'm not afraid of what you bring," Maren said. "I'm afraid of facing it alone." Asher looked at her, his deep eyes as if he had just opened up to the old sky from Ridge Valley. "Thanks, Ellie." In his eyes, for the first time, she saw something like relief, as if he had just unloaded some of the burden he had carried for years. But before they could say another word, a loud noise came from down the street. Not wind, not animal. The sound of something or someone struggling. They both turned toward the dark street. Asher tensed. They came back, and she understood, from this moment, everything would become more dangerous than anything she had ever thought. The sound from the main street made the air in the house constrict. Maren stood near the window, her hands on the wooden frame, her eyes fixed on where the darkness was thickest. Asher took a few steps forward, his gaze sharp like someone used to facing danger in silence. Not the sounds of this sleepy town, something stranger, sharper, as if a threat were lurking in the darkness. Asher told Maren to stay in the house. His voice was low and firm, but there was a palpable worry in it. She didn't argue, though her insides felt like they were on fire. She understood his need for freedom, and knew that if she followed him, he would double his risk just to keep her safe. He stepped out onto the porch, his keen eyes scanning the dark corners between the rows of wooden houses. The wind blew hard, causing the door of an old house to bang against the wall with a dry bang, as if to signal what was about to happen. As he approached the main street, Asher saw a dark figure hiding behind a lamppost with its lights off. The moment Asher's feet stopped, the figure immediately moved, rushing towards the alley. His instinct made him chase after it. But as he turned, Sheriff Turner's deep voice rang out from behind him. "Stop! Doyle! Not one person!" Asher turned. The sheriff stepped out of the shadows, clutching the worn-out pistol that hung at his side. His face was serious. Turner had clearly been watching the stranger. The two exchanged a brief glance, but it was enough to understand that the situation was far from normal. Silverbrush might be poor, it might be deserted, but it was not a place that was easy for strangers to stir up without a clear purpose. A sudden, distorted howl echoed from the old tavern, the sound sending chills down the spine. Sheriff Turner turned immediately, signaling Asher to follow. Asher's heart sank as he heard a second sound. It wasn't a howl anymore, but the loud crash of something heavy falling. That is the Maren family's lumberyard. Without another thought, Asher ran toward the cabin. Only one thing rang in his mind: Maren and her father were inside. He ran so fast that the wind whipped at his face and dust swirled up. Sheriff Turner followed him, no less. The sight before them made them both pause for a tense half-second. The door to the woodshed was forced open. A figure was rummaging inside, his breath filling the air. The pile of wood fell, creating a loud crash that Maren heard from the main house. The door swung open and she stepped out, her face filled with panic. When she saw Asher and the sheriff in front of the barn, she called Asher's name loudly, her voice a mixture of worry and fear. The stranger heard the noise and turned, his eyes sharp and hostile. He rushed out the door, but just as he crossed the wooden threshold, Sheriff Turner raised his gun. He shouted at him to stay still, but the stranger did not stop, but quickly pulled something from his coat. In that moment, it happened too fast. Maren cried out. Asher lunged forward with instinct honed by endless nights on the cattle drive. Sheriff pulled the trigger. The explosion echoed through the row of houses. After the gunshot, the heavy sound of a body falling made time seem to stand still. The stranger fell, still holding half the metal pipe. The sheriff stepped forward to inspect it, his eyes sharp but not happy. He knew this was not the last one. Asher turned immediately to Maren. She stood only a few feet away, her eyes wide with panic. He gripped her shoulders, his breath quick with worry. "Are you hurt?" "Ellie. No. I'm fine. But my dad." Before she could finish, a weak scream from Mr. Whitfield echoed from inside the house, making Maren's legs buckle. She rushed inside, Asher and Sheriff following. Mr. Whitfield was struggling to sit up, his face white with panic. The noise outside seemed to be making his illness worse. Maren held her father, her hands shaking slightly as she tried to prop him up on the pillows. Asher knelt beside them. He touched Mr. Whitfield's shoulder reassuringly. The poor father's face was weary, but even at his weakest, he tried to hold his daughter's hand. Each breath he took was like tearing paper. Asher looked at the sheriff, asking how many were around. Turner shook his head, saying he didn't know the exact number, but it was definitely more than one. What they both thought was that the man who had just been shot wasn't looking for gold or any other goods in the warehouse. He was looking for traces of Asher. At this moment, Maren's small voice rang out, as if pulled out from the deepest fear. "They came for you. Right, Asher?" Asher didn't speak right away. He looked at her, a tortured, thoughtful look. Then he nodded slowly, as if admitting something that hurt his heart more than his own wounds. "I'm sorry. Ellie." Maren bowed her head. The apology was heavier than the wind outside, but strangely, there was no blame in her eyes, only sorrow, knowing that Asher had lived too long in a spiral of pain without anyone standing by his side. Sheriff Turner placed his gun on the table, looked at the two of them for a long time before speaking in a stern but warm voice. "We need to keep each other safe. I don't agree with a lot of what you're bringing, Doyle, but we're on the same page. This is my town. I won't let anyone ruin it." Asher nodded. For the first time since returning to Silverbrush, he and the sheriff had come to a decision together, though it wasn't one of absolute trust. It carried a strange weight, like two unruly horses finally heading down the same trail to save something precious. Maren looked at them, at the way the two men stood together, opposites but both carrying their own wounds. The night outside had not yet ended, but in the small house, something had just come together, as if fate had drawn the three men into the same circle of danger. Asher turned back to her, his voice low but determined. "Ellie, I promise I won't let anyone hurt you or your father." That promise, in this stormy moment, was no longer the word of a 10-year-old boy. It was the oath of a man who understood the price of loss. And for Maren, those words touched a still corner of her heart, a corner she had long locked away with years of silence. That night, the wind still howled on the roof, but the peace in her heart, for the first time in years, did not completely disappear. In the wooden house, still smelling of gunpowder smoke from the chaos, Maren prepared a basin of warm water, her hands gentle but still trembling every time they touched her father's bruised skin. Mr. Whitfield was gradually calming down, breathing easier, but his eyes were still clouded with anxiety. It seemed that the noises had stirred up old fears he had kept hidden for many years. Asher stood near the door, saying nothing. He silently watched every movement in the room. The image of Maren bending over her father made him feel a strange warmth in his chest, but at the same time, a lingering pang of guilt crept up like a shadow. He knew that their peace had been threatened by his own past. Sheriff Turner returned after checking the area around the house with a cold face and a wary gaze. He put his hat on the table and spoke in a low voice. "There are second footprints leading towards the slope beside the forest. He escaped. We cannot take this lightly." Asher nodded. He knew it was about more than the strangers. It was also about the darkness that had haunted him for 2 years since his brother's death, untold secrets that would bring anyone seeking revenge to Silverbrush. Turner looked at Maren and Mr. Whitfield before lowering his voice, deliberately speaking only for Asher to hear. "I need to know who you messed with." "We can't fight in the dark," Asher replied without changing his expression. "It's not a matter of aggression. It's something I can't say yet. But I will, if it affects their safety." Turner wanted to press, but seeing Maren's eyes on them, he held back. The silence between the two men lasted a few beats. Then the sheriff took his hat back and stepped outside, saying he had to go on extra patrol. As Mr. Turner's footsteps faded, the house fell into a heavy silence. Maren put down the towel and turned to Asher. Her eyes were filled with so many questions she wanted to ask, but she had no idea where to start. Asher moved closer, his boots lightly clicking against the old wooden floor, a small sound echoing in the silence. "Ellie, I know you have 100 questions. If I could, I would answer them all. But not now." His voice dropped, as if he himself feared the truth about to come out. Maren looked at him, his figure leaning against the oil lamplight, casting a long shadow on the wall. It made him feel both peaceful and lonely, like someone who had crossed more borders than a man of his age should. "So, can you tell me something? Why are you in such danger that someone would come to this town?" Asher looked up, his gaze abysmal. He took another half-step forward, just enough distance for Maren to feel his breath on her own anxiety. Because 2 years ago, he did the right thing, but the price was not small. Maren waited for him to continue, but Asher shook his head slightly. When it's safer, I'll tell you everything. I don't want you to be caught up in what I've been through all this time. The answer didn't satisfy Maren, but she sensed the struggle inside him. She put her hand on Asher's arm, as if to draw the silence closer, not to hold him, but to let him know there was a safe place to lean. I don't need to know everything right now, but I need to know that you don't have to carry it alone anymore. No one should have to. Her words sank in slowly. Asher felt Maren's sincerity not with his ears, but with the sudden softening of his heart where he had long thought it had turned to stone. But suddenly, Mr. Whitfield opened his eyes and looked at them. Are you two okay? Maren hurried toward her father and took his hand. Asher also bowed his head in respect. We are fine, sir. Mr. Whitfield took a deep breath and looked at Asher for a long time. There was something searching and confiding in his sickly gaze. I owe you a debt of gratitude. Without you and Turner, things would have been worse. But think about Maren. She's had enough. Those words were like a knife, both painful and warm. Painful because they were true. Warm because he trusted him enough to say them. Asher bowed his head slightly. I know. I won't let anything come near them again. As Maren helped her father into the bedroom, Asher stood outside the door, watching his thin figure disappear behind the curtains. Suddenly, this small house felt different from the other places he had stopped on the road. It felt like home, a place he wanted to protect with his body. Maren returned, her eyes preoccupied as she looked out the window. The darkness outside no longer had the quiet of the afternoon. It had become a void where danger could lurk. Asher walked up to her. You should get some rest. Ellie, I'll keep watch. Maren shook her head, bowing her head slightly. I can't sleep. Not after what just happened. Asher thought for a moment and then said, So sit down here. I'll light the fire. Let's just sit still. Sometimes silence helps people find their breath. She was a little surprised by the gentleness he put into his words. Not sweet, not rushed, but like a light touch to the deepest part of her soul. The two of them sat near the fireplace. The firelight reflected off Maren's eyes, making them glow in the darkness, like a fire illuminating memories she didn't want to recall. Asher saw the weariness in her shoulders. He wanted to put his hand on them, but didn't dare, afraid to make her choose when she was so confused. A long moment passed with only the crackling of the firewood. Maren spoke, her voice as small as mist. Asher, did you ever think returning to Silverbrush would bring you face to face with things you've never even heard of? He looked at her, unblinking. I know, but this time, I want to face it, because I'm not alone anymore. Maren shivered slightly at the words, not because of the cold. She looked at him for so long that it felt like she was looking through every wound, every memory of his. Asher was about to stand up to check the door, but Maren spoke softly. Can I stay a little longer? He paused, for a moment. His silent firmness softened like rain-soaked earth. He sat back, a little closer to her. In the firelight, two hearts that seemed to have lost their warmth were suddenly pulled closer together, not by words of love, nor by promises, but by a rare silence that made both of them feel that tomorrow, no matter how stormy, there would still be a place to return to. Outside, the wind beat hard against the roof, carrying a long howl across the pine hills, but in the small room, the silence between the two people was like a soft blanket wrapping all their fears, allowing them to breathe easier, No one knew where the chase would lead, but tonight, one thing was clearer than ever. Asher Doyle is slowly opening a door he kept locked for years, and Maren Whitfield has stepped through that threshold with a heart braver than she knew, a beginning of something they dare not name. The wind blew across Mesquite Hill, carrying the scent of dry earth and the chill of distant skies. Asher walked cautiously up the slope. Under his feet, the soil was churned by unfamiliar boot prints, a sign that his pursuer had not left Silverbrush. He bent down and touched a new, dark print. The silence around him was so long it reminded him of nights spent alone across the desert, facing darkness greater than fear. Behind him, Sheriff Turner scanned the area near the broken wooden fence. His steely demeanor did not hide his anxiety. No one in town felt at ease after the shooting. Though life continued as usual, even the less concerned residents looked at each other more, as if sensing a storm was approaching. Turner asked Asher where the footprints had gone. Asher replied with certainty that the person had gone into the wide valley behind the hill. It was a place with few people and thick undergrowth, perfect for hiding. Turner squinted in the direction Asher pointed, his face showing nothing but caution. "We can't let him come back to town. Not tonight. Not ever." Asher nodded. His voice was low but firm. "They won't stop until they believe I have nothing, or until they are forced to give up." Turner crossed his arms, looking straight at Asher. "If you leave before this is over, they'll go to Maren's house first. You know that." Asher felt his heart clench. He knew the truth wasn't just in Turner's head. It was the loss he'd carried with him for years, losses that had made him wary of anything that might take another person he cared about. Asher replied in a soft but firm voice, "I won't let that happen, even if it takes burning down every dark corner of this town to find them." Turner looked at him a moment longer before exhaling. Perhaps for the first time, he believed Asher more than before. They continued following the footprints. The ground here was dry and rocky, making it difficult to follow. But Asher noticed something else. A small piece of paper was stuck between two rocks. He bent down to pick it up. It was thin, with a few words scribbled on it in smudged black ink. "Meet at Lewin Ridge. Old debts must not be forgotten." Asher clenched the paper, his eyes growing colder. Turner glanced at it, immediately understanding that this was no ordinary threat. It reminded him of a past Asher had tried to bury. As the wind changed direction, Asher turned to Turner. "We should go back before it gets dark. I don't want Maren to be alone." Turner nodded. He had his reasons for wanting to return to town, especially since he knew Asher's pursuer was no ordinary man. Asher didn't say much on the way back. His heart felt heavier. Memories of Lewin Ridge that had seemed lost in the darkness surfaced again. Jonah's face appeared in his mind, along with his fading breath in the makeshift tent amid the raging malaria. Jonah whispered as he was dying, "Don't let them have it. Don't let anyone else die because of it." At the time, Asher thought Jonah was afraid the smugglers would pursue him to the end to get the diary. But later, he understood that the diary was not what they wanted. They only believed what they wanted to believe. They believed that Jonah was hiding something valuable, so Asher had to keep it. A false belief could kill. Asher knew that better than anyone. When Asher and Turner reached Maren's yard, the warm yellow light from the window made his chest feel a little better. The door opened a crack, and Maren stepped out, her eyes wide with worry. As soon as she saw Asher, relief spread across her face, though she tried to remain calm. "I'm back," Maren said softly. Asher stepped closer, replying in a warmer voice, "I promised." Her eyes softened at that. Turner avoided their gazes and entered the house to check on Mr. Whitfield, leaving them alone. Maren looked at Asher as if trying to read something in him. Will they come back? Asher does not hide. Yes. And they will come back again. Maren clenched her hands, but unlike her initial fear, this time she felt calmer. She could clearly feel the change inside her. She was no longer the girl who had endured everything alone. Asher's presence made her strong in ways she had never expected. I'm not asking you to fight for me, Maren said softly, but I don't want you to fight alone. Asher stood still. Her words cut deeper than any knife had ever scarred him. He looked down into her eyes, a rare firmness he had not known he possessed. No one has ever said that to me. Maren took a step closer, close enough for him to catch her light scent, the scent of pine and cinnamon wafting from the kitchen, because you never gave anyone a chance to stand next to you. Asher. The words made his breath stop for a moment without him realizing it. He knew it was brutally true. For years he had avoided commitment, because if he lost someone else, he might not be able to get up. But now, standing before him was Maren, the girl he had promised to return to when they were just children, and his heart knew that she was the only thing that made him want to stay, no matter what danger lurked. A small noise from inside the house brought them back to reality. Turner came out and said her father was sleeping. He also said he would return to patrol the area around the pub before leaving. Turner stopped to look at Asher. Meet me at the office tomorrow morning. We need to talk things through. Asher nodded. No objection. When Turner was out of sight, Asher turned to look at Maren. She stood still, but her eyes were abuzz with words. I'll tell you everything, Asher said, but not until the danger has receded a step. Maren smiled sadly. The smile was filled with trust, worry, and hope that he wouldn't disappear into the darkness again. I believe you, but don't let past pain dictate what you choose now. Asher heard that as if he were hearing the words of his own lost self. He stood for a long time on the porch, watching Maren walk closer. In that brief moment, he felt his past, like the layers of dust on his boots, falling off one grain at a time, not gone, but lighter, easier to breathe. And then, as the wind blew through the curtains, they both realized something was changing. Not the wind, not the storm, but it is them. A quiet rebirth begins from what was thought to be lost. The sky above Silverbrush glowed with a soft light, like the ashes of a long night's worth of burnt-out coals. The color reminded Asher of the early days when he and Maren had chased each other in the dim light, as if the world had been nothing but two children with no fear except that the other would not come tomorrow. Standing in Sheriff Turner's office today, he felt as if the things that had never been said were demanding to be said. He couldn't wait any longer. He couldn't let Silverbrush worry any longer. And he couldn't let Maren live another day in fear of his past. Turner opened the door and ushered Asher in with a look that was half hard, half softer than before. The frown on his forehead was still there, but less intense, as if he had seen something reassuring in the chaos of the night before. Sit down. We need to clear things up before anything else happens, Turner said. Asher nodded, his hands on the table. His voice was low as he began to tell. No more hiding, no more avoiding. He told all about Jonah Kelman, about the men who had worked with him at Lewin Ridge, about the group of people who believed Jonah had found a gold run in the northern mountains and that Jonah had hidden it before he died. But the truth was painfully simple. Jonah had nothing but a few journal entries and a heart too kind in a place that tolerated nothing. Too kind. Asher tells how he delivered Jonah's final message to his mother, and how he was threatened, stalked, and forced to leave the lands he traveled to, all because a group of people refused to accept that the truth wasn't what they wanted. Turner listened in silence. No interruptions. No questions. When Asher paused, he folded his arms and looked out the window. The early morning light on his face deepened the lines, but his gaze was no longer distant. What he did for little Jonah was right, but right without being wise, and now Silverbrush must face the consequences. Asher bowed his head as if accepting responsibility, but Turner continued, more gently, "But I won't let Silverbrush fall because of a few lunatics. I need a plan. Not just to protect you, but to protect Maren and her father." The name Maren made Asher's chest tighten. He looked up at Turner and saw that his eyes were no longer filled with doubt, but with an unspoken acknowledgement. An acknowledgement that something had grown between him and Maren that no one could pretend not to see. Turner stood up and walked to the large table behind him. He spread out a map showing the Mesquite Hills area, the exit to the valley, and possible hiding spots. "We lure them out of town. Catch them where they can't hurt anyone. I don't want bloodshed. But if I have to, I will." Asher nodded. Not cold agreement, but the acceptance of someone ready to end something that had haunted him for 2 years. When Turner handed Asher the pouch of ammo and the spare gun, Asher took it with a firm, quiet hand. He didn't want to fight, but he wouldn't let Maren live another day in fear. Turner added one last sentence, which surprised Asher. "No matter what happens today, you have to live. Not just for yourself, but for someone waiting for you to come back." The sincerity of the statement made Asher nod respectfully. The two left the office as the light spread. The soft sunlight touched the distant mountains, a golden glow that reminded them that no matter how long the night, a new day could come. Asher turned toward the familiar house. The door was still ajar, as it had been the night before. When he entered, Maren was setting down her bowl of porridge. The sunlight shone on her hair, making each strand catch the light. Her figure was slim but strong, like the Western women who had endured life but never lost the softness of their souls. She looked at him, a smile appearing very slowly. "He went to see Sheriff Turner." Asher nodded. Maren asked what she knew was most important. "You will go." "Right." Asher approached her, each step showing an irreversible determination. "I will end this. I will not let anyone near you again. I will not let my past touch this place again." Maren bowed her head. Her fingers touched the edge of the table, trembling slightly. She spoke in a voice as quiet as silk. "I don't want you to go alone. I'm afraid of something I won't dare say." Asher understood. He understood before she could finish. He touched her hand, not letting it fall into the void. "I've been alone for so long, Ellie. Today, for the first time, I know I have a place to go." Maren looked up, her eyes as clear as spring water. For the first time, she allowed herself to look at him with her heart, not her fear. She said a sentence that made time stand still. "Asher, when you come back, I'll be here." Those words were like a bell that opened a door deep in his heart. Not a promise, not a word of love. Just the heart of someone who had hurt enough to understand that true love always comes after the broken pieces. Asher tilted his head and placed a light kiss on her forehead, a kiss like a touch of wind, unhurried, unpossessing. Just gratitude, tenderness, and an unspoken vow. He turned away. Maren held his hand for a single second, then let go. Not clinging, not asking if he was sure, because she knew the man standing before her lived by honor and promise. Asher left the house. The wind blew from Ridge Valley, carrying the scent of dry earth and sunshine. His steps were sure, his features focused, as if his whole life were preparing to close a door he had left open for too long. As he and Turner left Silverbrush together, their shadows stretched along the red dirt road, blending into the early light. Not two dangerous hunters, but two men with a past, searching for an end to something that had no end. Maren stood on the porch, watching, not with a desperate worry, but with a heart that knew that sometimes one had to leave in order to truly return, and this time, she believed he would return. Not as a man hunted by the past, not as a lonely cowboy carrying a nameless pain, but as a man who kept his last promise. Silverbrush was quieter than usual that day, but in the silence, something was growing. A rebirth, a chance, a promise at the end of the road, and at the end of brave choices, love, though few words, still finds its way back. Maren and Asher's story reminds us of a simple truth that everyone has experienced. People can endure a lot of loss, but the heart can always be restored if we give it a chance. Sometimes, silence is the armor that covers the deepest wounds, and just need a sincere person standing by to gradually dissolve that silence. The sunset of life is not just about looking back, but realizing that we still have the right to choose peace for the rest of our lives. The promise of the past, if kept with a kind heart, will become a bridge for us to cross the loneliness and find ourselves again. We all lose something, but like Maren and Asher, as long as our hearts are touched by kindness and the presence of someone who truly understands us, there is hope. Thank you for taking the time to read this emotional story. If it resonated with you, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to bring you more healing journeys.